A mere look, word, or motion, a mistake, accident, or want of power, are all matters for which a slave may be whipped at any time. Does a slave look dissatisfied? It is said that he has the devil in him, and must be whipped out. Does he speak loudly when spoken to by his master? Then he's getting high-minded, and should be taken down a buttonhole lower. Does he forget to pull off his hat at the approach of a white person? Then he is wanting in reverence, and should be whipped for it. Does he ever venture to vindicate his conduct when censured for it? Then he is guilty of imprudence, one of the greatest crimes of which a slave can be guilty. Does he ever venture to suggest a different mode of doing things from that pointed out by his master? He is indeed presumptuous in getting above himself, and nothing less than a flogging will do for him. Does he, while plowing, break a plow, or while hoeing, break a hoe? It is owing to his carelessness, and for it a slave must always be whipped. Mr. Hopkins could always find something of this sort to justify the use of the lash, and when he seldom failed to embrace such opportunities, there was not a man in the whole county for whom the slaves who had the getting their own home would not prefer to live, rather than with this Reverend Mr. Hopkins. And yet there was not a man anywhere round who made higher professions of religion, or was more active in revivals, more attentive to the class, love, feast, prayer, and preaching meetings, or more devotional in his family, that prayed earlier, later, louder, and longer, than the same reverend slave-driver, Rigby Hopkins. But to return to Mr. Freeland, and my experience while in his employment, he, like Mr. Covey, gave us enough to eat, but, unlike Mr. Covey, he also gave us sufficient time to take our meals. He worked us hard, but always between sunrise and sunset. He required a good deal of work to be done, but gave us good tools with which to work. His farm was large, but he employed hands of enough to work it, and with ease compared to many of his neighbors. My treatment, while in his employment, was heavenly compared to what I experienced at the hands of Mr. Covey. Mr. Freeland was himself the owner of but 2 slaves. Their names were Henry Harris and John Harris. The rest of his hands he hired. These consisted of myself, Sandy Jenkins, and Handy Caldwell. Henry and John were quite intelligent, and in a very little while after I went there, I succeeded in creating in them a strong desire to learn how to read. This desire soon sprang up in others also. They very soon mustered up some of the old spelling books, and nothing would do but that I would keep a Sabbath school. I agreed to do so, and accordingly devoted my Sundays to teaching these my beloved fellow slaves how to read. Neither of them knew his letters when I went there. Some of the slaves of the neighboring farms found. This is the same man who gave me the root to prevent me from being whipped by Mr. Covey. He was a clever soul. We used to frequently talk about the fight with Covey, and often as we did so, he would claim my success as the result of the root by which he gave me. The superstition is very common among the most ignorant slaves. A slave seldom dies, but that his death is attributed to trickery. Oh, some of the slaves of the surrounding farms found what was going on, and also availed themselves of this little opportunity to learn to read. It was understood among those who came that there must be as little display about it as possible. It was necessary to keep our religious matters at St. Michael's unacquainted with the fact that instead of spending the Sabbath in wrestling, boxing, and drinking whiskey, we were trying to learn how to read the will of God, for they had much rather see us engaged in those degrading sports than to see us behaving like intellectual, moral, and accountable beings. My blood boils as to think of the bloody manner by which misers, Wright Fairbanks and Garrison West, both class leaders in connection with many others, rushed in upon us with sticks and stones, and broke up our virtuous little Sabbath school at St. Michael's, all calling ourselves Christians, humble followers of the Lord Jesus Christ. But again, I am digressing. I held my Sabbath school in the house of free colored men, whose name I deem it imprudent to mention, for it should be known it might embarrass him greatly. Though the crime of holding the school was committed 10 years ago, I had at one time over 40 scholars, and those of the right sort, ardently desiring to learn. They were of all ages, though mostly men and women. I look back at those Sundays with a great amount of pleasure, not to be expressed. Those were great days to my soul. The work of instructing my dear fellow slaves was the sweetest engagement with which I was ever blessed. We loved each other, and to leave them at the close of Sabbath was a severe cross indeed. When I think of these precious souls are, and where they are today, shut up in the prison house of slavery, my feelings overcome me, and I am almost ready to ask, does a righteous God govern the universe? And for what does he hold the thunders in his right hand, if not to smite the oppressor, and deliver the spoiled out of the hand of the spoiler? These dear souls have not come to Sabbath school because it was popular to do so, nor did I teach them because it was reputable to be thus engaged. Every moment they spent in that school they were liable to be taken up and given 39 lashes. They came because they wished to learn. Their minds had been starved by their cruel masters. They had been shut up in mental darkness. I taught them, because it was the delight of my soul to be doing something that looked like bettering the condition of my race. I kept up my school nearly the whole year I lived with Mr. Freeland, and besides my Sabbath school, I devoted 3 evenings in the week during the winter to teach the slaves at home. And I have the happiness to know that several of those who came to the Sabbath school learned how to read, and that one at least is now free through my agency. The year passed off smoothly. It seemed only about half as long as the year which preceded it. I went through it without receiving a single blow. I will give Mr. Freeland the credit of being the best master I had till I became my own master. For ease with which I passed the year, I was, however, somewhat indebted to the society of my fellow slaves. They were noble souls. They not only possessed loving hearts, but brave ones. We were linked and interlinked with each other. I loved them with a love stronger than anything I have ever experienced since. It is something that we slaves do not love and confide in each other. In answer to this assertion, I can say I never loved any or confided in any person more than my fellow slaves, especially with those whom I lived at Mr. Freeland's. I believe we would have died for each other. We never undertook to do anything of any importance without a mutual consultation. We never moved separately. We were one, and as much so by our tempers and dispositions, as by the mutual hardships to which we were necessarily subjected by our condition as slaves. By the close of the year 1834, Mr. Freeland again hired me of my master for the year 1835. But by this time I began to want to live upon free land, as well as with Freeland, and I was no longer content, therefore, to live with him or any other slaveholder. I began, with the commencement of the year, to prepare myself for a final struggle, which I should decide my fate one way or the other. My tendency was upward. I was fast approaching manhood, and year after year had passed, and I was still a slave. These thoughts aroused me. I must do something. I therefore resolved that 1835 should not pass without witnessing an attempt on my part to secure my liberty. But I was not willing to cherish this determination alone. My fellow slaves were dear to me. I was anxious to have them participate with me in this, my life-giving determination. I have therefore thought with great prudence, commenced early to ascertain their views and feelings in regard to their condition, and to imbue their minds with thoughts of freedom. I bent myself to devising ways and means for our escape, and somewhile strove, on all fitting occasions, to impress them with the gross fraud and inhumanity of slavery. I went first to Henry, next to John, then to the others. I found in them all warm hearts and noble spirits. They were ready to hear, and ready to act when a feasible plan should be proposed. This was what I wanted. I talked to them of our want of manhood, if we submitted to our enslavement, without at least one noble effort to be free. We met often, and consulted frequently, and told our hopes and fears, recounted the difficulties, real and imagined, which we would be called on to meet. At times we were almost disposed to give up, and try to content ourselves with our wretched lot. At others, we were firm and unbending in our determination to go. Wherever we suggested any plan, there was shrinking. The odds were fearful. Our path was beset with the greatest obstacles, and if we succeeded in gaining the end of it, our right to be free was yet questionable. We were yet liable to be returned to bondage. We could see no spot, this side of the ocean, where we could be free. We knew nothing about Canada. Our knowledge of the North did not extend farther than New York, and to go there and be forever harassed with the frightful liability of being returned to slavery, with the certainty of being treated tenfold worse than before, the thought was truly a horrible one, and one which was not easy to overcome. The case sometimes stood thus. At every gate through which we were to pass, we saw a watchman; at every ferry, a guard; on every bridge, a sentinel; and in every wood, a patrol. We were hemmed in upon every side. Here were the difficulties, real or imagined, the good to be sought, and the evil to be shunned. On the right hand there stood slavery, a stern reality, glaringly frightful upon us, its robes already crimsoned with the blood of millions, and even now feasting itself greedily upon our flesh. On the other hand, always back away in the dim distance, under the flickering light of the North Star, behind some craggy hill or snow-covered mountain, stood a doubtful freedom, half frozen, beckoning us to come and share its hospitality. This in itself was sometimes enough to stagger us, but when we permitted ourselves to survey the road, we were frequently appalled. Upon either side we saw grim death, assumed the most horrid shapes. Now it was starvation, causing us to eat our own flesh. Now that we were contending with the waves and we drowned. Now we were overtaken and torn to pieces by the fangs of the terrible bloodhound. We were stung by scorpions, chased by wild beasts, bitten by snakes, and finally, after having nearly reached the desired spot, after swimming rivers, encountering wild beasts, sleeping on the woods, suffering hunger and nakedness, we were overtaken by our pursuers, and in our resistance, we were shot dead upon the spot. I say this picture sometimes appalled us, and made us rather bear those ills we had, than fly to others that we knew not of. In coming to a fixed determination to run away, we did more than Patrick Henry, when he resolved upon liberty or death. With us it was a doubtful liberty at most, and a certain death if we failed. For my part, I should prefer death to hopeless bondage. Sadly, one of our number gave up the notion, but still encouraged us. His name was Sandy. Our company then consisted of Henry Harris, John Harris, Henry Bailey, Charles Roberts, and myself. Henry Bailey was my uncle, and belonged to my master. Charles married my aunt. He belonged to my master's father-in-law, Mr. William Hamilton. The plan was finally concluded upon, and it was decided to get a large canoe belonging to Mr. Hamilton, and upon the Saturday night previous to Easter holidays, paddle directly up the Chesapeake Bay. On our arrival at the head of the bay, a distance of 70 or 80 miles from where we lived, It was our purpose to turn our canoe adrift and follow the guidance of the North Star till we got beyond the limits of Maryland. Our reason for making the water route was that we were less liable to be suspected as runaways. We hoped to be regarded as fishermen, whereas if we should take the land route, we should be subjected to interruptions of almost every kind. Any one having a white face and being so disposed could stop us and subject us to examination. The week before our intended start, I wrote several protections, one for each of us, as well as I can. Remember that these were in the following words: "This to certify that I, the undersigned, have given the bearer, my servant, full liberty to go to Baltimore and spend the Easter holidays. Written with mine own hand, 1835, William Hamilton." Near St. Michael's in Talbot County, Maryland, we were not going to Baltimore, but going up the bay. We went toward Baltimore, and these protections were only intended to protect us while on the bay. As the time grew near to our departure, our anxiety became more and more intense. It was truly a matter of life and death with us. The strength of our determination was about to be fully tested. At this time, I was very active in explaining every difficulty, removing every doubt, dispelling every fear, and inspiring all with the firmness indispensable to success in our undertaking. Assuring them that half was gained the instant we made the move. We had talked long enough. We were now ready to move. If not now, we never would be. And if we did not intend to move now, we had as well fold our arms, sit down, and acknowledge ourselves fit only to be slaves. This none of us were prepared to acknowledge. Every man stood firm, and at our last meeting we pledged ourselves afresh, in the most solemn manner, that at the time appointed we would certainly start in pursuit of freedom. This was in the middle of the week, at the end of which we were to be off. We went as usual to our several fields of labor, but with bosoms highly agitated with the thought of our truly hazardous undertaking. We tried to conceal our feelings as much as possible, and I think we succeeded very well. After a painful waiting, the Saturday morning, whose night was to witness our departure, came. I hailed it with joy, bringing what of sadness it might. Friday night was a sleepless one for me. I probably felt more anxious than the rest, because I was, by common consent, at the head of the whole affair. The responsibility of success or failure lay heavily upon me. The glory of the one and the confusion of the other were alike mine. The first 2 hours of that morning were such as I never experienced before, and hope never to again. Early in the morning we went, as usual, to the field. We were spreading manure, and at once, while thus engaged, I was overwhelmed with an indescribable feeling, in the fullness of which I turned to Sandy, who was near by, and said, "We are betrayed!" "Well," said he, "that thought has this moment struck me." We said no more. I was never more certain of anything. The horn was blown as usual, and I went up with him from the field to the house for breakfast. I went for the form more than for the want of anything to eat that morning. Just as I got in the house, and looking at the lane gate, I saw 4 white men with 2 colored men. The white men were on horseback, and the colored ones were walking behind, as if tied. I watched them a few moments till they had got in our lane gate. Here they halted, and tied the colored men to the gate post. I was not yet certain as to what the matter was. In a few moments in rode Mr. Hamilton, in a speed betokening great excitement. He came to the door, and inquired if Mr. William was in. He was told he was at the barn. Mr. Hamilton, without dismounting, rode up to the barn in an extraordinary speed. In a few moments he and Mr. Freeland returned to the house. By this time the 3 constables rode up, and in great haste dismounted, tied their horses, and met Master Williams and Mr. Hamilton returning to the barn, and after talking a while, they walked up to the kitchen door. There was no one in the kitchen but myself and John. Henry and Sandy were at the barn. Mr. Freeland put his head at the door, and called me by name, saying there was some gentleman at the door who wished to see me. I stepped to the door and inquired what they wanted. They at once seized me, and without giving me any satisfaction, tied me, lashing my hands closely together. I insisted upon knowing what the matter was. They at length said they had learned that I had been in a scrape, and that I was to be examined before my master, and their information proved false, I should not be hurt. In a few moments they succeeded in tying John. Then they turned to Henry, who had by this time returned to command, and commanded him to cross his hands. "I won't," said Henry in a firm tone, indicating his readiness to meet the consequences of his refusal. "Won't you?" said Tom Graham, the constable. "No, I won't," said Henry, in a stronger tone. With this, the two constables pulled out their shining pistols and swore by their Creator that they would make him cross his hands or kill him. Each cocked his pistol, and with the finger on the trigger, walked up to Henry, saying at the same time if he did not cross his hands they would blow his heart out. Shoot me, said Henry. "You can't kill me but once." Shoot, and be damned. I won't be tied." This he said in a loud tone of defiance, and at the same time, with a motion as quick as lightning, he with one stroke dashed the pistol from the hands of each constable. As he did this, his hands fell upon him, and after beating him some time, they finally overpowered and got him tied. During the scuffle I managed, I know not how, to get my pass out, and without being discovered, put it into the fire. We are all now tied, and just as we were about to leave for Eastman jail, Betsy Freeland, the mother of William Freeland, came to the door with her hands full of biscuits, and divided them between Henry and John. She then delivered herself a speech of the following effect, addressing herself to me. She said, "You devil, you yellow devil, it was you that put into the heads of Henry and John to run away. But for you, you long-legged devil, Henry nor John would never have thought of such a thing." I made no reply, and was immediately hurried off toward St. Michael's. Just a few moments previous to the scuffle with Henry, Mr. Hamilton suggested the propriety of making a search for the protections which he had understood Frederic had written for himself and the rest. But at the moment he was about carrying the proposal into effect, his aid was needed to helping to tie Henry, and the excitement attendant the scuffle caused them either to forget nor seem it unsafe under the circumstances to search. So we were not yet convicted of the intention to run away. When we got about halfway to St. Michael's, while the constables having us in charge were looking ahead, Henry inquired of me what he should do with his pass. I told him to eat it with his biscuit and own nothing, and we passed the word aloud, "Own nothing," and "own nothing," said we all. Our confidence in each other was unshaken. We were resolved to succeed or fail together. After the calamity had befallen us as much as before, we were now prepared for anything. We were to be dragged that morning 15 miles behind horses, and then to be placed in the Easton jail. When we reached St. Michael's, we underwent a sort of examination. We all denied that we ever intended to run away. We did this more to bring out the evidence against us than for any hope of getting clear of being sold, for, as I have said, we were ready for that. The fact was, we cared little about where we went, so that we went together. Our greatest concern was about separation. We dreaded that more than anything this side of death. We found the evidence against us to be testimony of one person. Our master would not tell us who it was, but it came to a unanimous decision amongst ourselves as to who the informant was. We were sent off to the jail at Easton. When we got there, we were delivered up to the sheriff, Mr. Joseph Graham, and by him placed in jail. Henry, John, and myself were placed in one room together, Charles and Henry Bailey in another. Their object in separating us was to hinder concert. We had been in jail scarcely 20 minutes when a swarm of slave traders and agents for slave traders flocked into jail to look at us, and to ascertain if we were for sale. Such a set of beings I've never saw before. I felt myself surrounded by so many fiends from perdition. A band of pirates never looked more like us, more like their father, the devil. They laughed and grinned over us, saying, "Ah, my boys, we have got you, haven't we?" And after taunting us in various ways, They one by one went into examination of us, with intent to ascertain our value. They would impudently ask us if we would not like to have them for our masters. We would make them no answer, and leave them to find out as best they could. They would curse and swear at us, telling us they could take the devil out of us in a very little time, while we were only in their hands. While in jail, we found ourselves in much more comfortable quarters than we expected when we went there. We did not get much to eat, nor that which was very good, but we had a good clean room, from the window of which we could see what was going on in the street, which was very much better than though we had been placed in one of the dark, damp cells. Upon the whole, we got along very well, so far as the jail and its keeper were concerned. Immediately after the holidays were over, contrary to all our expectations, Mr. Hamilton and Mr. Freeland came up to Easton and took Charles, the two Henrys, and John out of jail and carried them home, leaving me alone. I regarded this separation as a final one. It caused me more pain than anything else in the whole transaction. I was ready for anything rather than separation. I suppose that they had consulted together and decided that, as I was the whole cause of the intention of the others to run away, it was hard to make the innocent suffer with the guilty, and that they had, therefore, concluded to take the others home and sell me, as a warning to the others that remained. It is due to the noble Henry to say that he seemed almost as reluctant at leaving the prison as leaving home to come to the prison. But we knew we should, in all probability, be separated. If we were sold, and since he was their hands, he concluded to go peacefully home. I was now left to my fate. I was all alone, and within the walls of a stone prison. But a few days before, I was full of hope. I expected to have been safe in a land of freedom, but now I was discovered with gloom, sunk down to the utmost despair. I thought the possibility of freedom was gone. I kept in this way about 1 week, at the end of which, Captain Auld, my master, to my surprise and utter astonishment, came up and took me out, with the intention of sending me, with a gentleman of his acquaintance, into Alabama. But from some cause or another, he did not send me to Alabama, but concluded to send me back to Baltimore, to live again with his brother Hugh, and to learn a trade. Thus, after absence of 3 years and 1 month, I was more permitted to return to my old home at Baltimore. My master sent me away, because there existed against me a very real prejudice in the community, and he feared I might be killed. In a few weeks after I went to Baltimore, Master Hugh hired me to Mr. William Gardner, an extensive shipbuilder on Fell's Point. I was put there to learn how to caulk. It, however, proved a very unfavorable place for the accomplishment of this object. Mr. Gardner was engaged that spring in building 2 large man-of-war brigs, professedly in the Mexican government. The vessels were to be launched in the July of that year, and in the failure thereof Mr. Gardner was to lose a considerable sum, so that when I entered, all was hurry. There was no time to learn anything. Every man had to do that which he knew how to do. And entering the shipyard, my orders for Mr. Gardner were, do whatever the carpenters command me to do. This was placing me at the beck and call of about 75 men. I was to regard them all as masters. Their word was to be my law. My situation was a most trying one. At times I needed a dozen pair of hands. I was called a dozen ways to the space of a single minute. 3 or 4 voices would strike my ear at the same moment. It was Fred! Come help me to count this timber here. Fred! Come carry this lumber yonder. Fred! Bring that roller here. Fred! Go get a fresh can of water. Fred! Come help saw off the end of this timber. Fred! Go quick and get the crowbar. Fred! Hold on to the end of this fall. Fred! Go to the blacksmith shop and get a new punch. Hurrah, Fred! Run and bring me a cold chisel. I say, Fred, bear a hand and get up fire as quick as lightning under that steam box. Hello! Come turn this grindstone. Come, come, move, move, and bows the timber forward. Blast your eyes! Why don't you heat up some pitch? Hello, hello, hello! Come here, go there, hold on! Where are you? Damn you if you move! I'll knock your brains out! That was my school for 8 months, and I might have remained there longer, but for a most horrid fight I had with 4 of the white apprentices, for which my left eye was nearly knocked out, and I was horribly mangled in other respects. The facts in this case were these. Until a very little while after I went there, white and black ship carpenters worked side by side, and no one seemed to see any impropriety in it. All hands seemed to be very well satisfied. Many of the black carpenters were freemen. Things seemed to be going on well. At once the white carpenters knocked off and said they would not work with free-colored workmen. Their reason for this, as alleged, was that if I was a free-colored carpenter, if they were there and encouraged, they would soon take the trade to their own hands, and the poor white men would be thrown out of employment. They therefore felt called upon at once to put a stop to it, and taking advantage of Mr. Gardner's necessities, they broke off, swearing they would work no longer until I lost my spot. Unless he discharged his black carpenters. Now, though this did not extend to me in form, it did reach me, in fact. My fellow apprentices very soon began to feel it degraded to them to work with me. They began to put on airs, in saying that we slaves should be caught and killed, and that being encouraged by the journeymen, they commenced making my condition as hard as they could, by hectoring me around, and sometimes striking me. And I, of course, kept the vow I made after the fight with Mr. Covey, and struck back again, regardless of consequences. While I kept them from combining, I succeeded very well, for I could whip the whole of them, taking them separately. They, however, at length combined and came upon me, armed with sticks and stones and heavy handspikes. One came in front with a half-brick, and there was one at each side of me, and one behind me. While I was attending to those in front, and on either side, the one behind ran up with a handspike, and struck me a heavy blow to the head. It stunned me. I fell, and with this they all ran upon me, and fell to beating me with their fists. I lay on the ground for a while, gathering strength. In an instant I gave a sudden surge, and rose to my hands and knees. And just as I did that, one of their numbers gave me with his heavy boot a powerful kick in the left eye. My eyeball seemed to have burst. When they saw my eye closed and badly swollen, they left me. With this I seized the handspike, and for a time pursued them. But here the carpenters interfered, and I thought I might as well give it up. It was impossible to stand my hand against so many. All this took place in sight of no less than 50 white ship carpenters, and not one interposed a friendly word. But some cried, "Kill him, kill him. He struck a white person." I found my only chance for life was in flight. I succeeded in getting away without additional blow, and barely so, for to strike a white man is death by lynch law, and that this was the law in Mr. Gardner's shipyard. Nor was there any other law on Mr. Gardner's shipyard. I went directly home and told the story of my wrongs to Master Hugh, and I am happy to say of him, irreligious as he was, his conduct was heavenly compared to that of his brother Thomas under similar circumstances. He listened attentively to my narration of the circumstances leading to the savage outrage, and gave many proofs of his long indignation at it. The heart of my once overkind mistress was again melted into pity. My puffed-out eye and blood-covered face moved her to tears. She took a chair by me, washed the blood from my face, and with a mother's tenderness, bound up my head, covered the wounded eye with a lean piece of fresh beef. It was almost compensation for my suffering to witness, once more, a manifestation of kindness from this. My once affectionate old mistress, Master Hughes, was very much enraged. He gave expression of his feelings by pouring out curses upon the heads of those who did the deed. As soon as I got a little better of my bruises, He took me with him to Esquire Watson's on Bond Street to see what could be done about the matter. Mr. Watson inquired who saw the assault committed. Master Hugh told him it was done at Mr. Gardner's shipyard at midday, and there was a large company of men at work. As to that, he said, the deed was done, and there was no question as to who did it. His answer was he could do nothing in the case unless some white men would come forward and testify. He could issue no warrant on my word. If I had been killed in the presence of 1,000 colored people, their testimony combined would have been insufficient to have arrested one of the murderers. Master Hugh, for one, was compelled to say this state of things was too bad. Of course, it was impossible to get any white man to volunteer his testimony on my behalf, and against the white young man, even though many who may have sympathized with me were not prepared to do this. It required a degree of courage unknown to them to do so. For just at that time the slightest manifestation of humanity toward a colored person was denounced as abolitionism, and that name subjected to its bearer a frightful liability. The watchwords of the bloody-minded in that region in those days were, "Damn the abolitionists." There was nothing done, and probably nothing would have been done if I had been killed. Such was, and such remains, the state of things in the Christian city of Baltimore. Master Hughes, finding he could get no redress, refused to let me go back again to Mr. Gardner. He kept me himself, and his wife dressed my wound till I was again restored to health. He then took me into the shipyard of which he was the foreman, in the employment of Mr. Walter Price. There I was immediately set to caulking, and very soon learned the art of using my mallet and irons. In the course of 1 year from the time I left Mr. Gardner's, I was able to command the highest wages given to the most experienced caulkers. I was now of some importance to my master. I was bringing him from $6 to $7 per week. I sometimes brought him $9 per week. My wages were $1.50 a day. After learning how to caulk, I sought my own employment, and made my own contracts, and collected the money which I learned. My pathway became much smoother than before. My condition was now much more comfortable. When I could get no caulking to do, I did nothing. During these leisure times, old notions about freedom would steal over me again. When in Mr. Gardner's employment, I was kept in such a perpetual whirl of excitement, I could think of nothing, scarcely, but my life, and in thinking of my life, I almost forgot my liberty. I observed this in my experience of slavery, that whenever my condition was improved, instead of its increasing my contentment, it only increased my desire to be free, and set me to thinking of plans to gain my freedom. I have found that, to make a contented slave, it is necessary to make a thoughtless one. It is necessary to darken his morals and mental vision, and as far as possible, to annihilate the power of reason. He must be able to detect no inconsistencies in slavery. He must be made to feel that slavery is right, and he can be brought to that only when he ceases to be a man. I was now getting, as I had said, $1.50 per day. I was contracted for it. I earned it. It was paid to me. It was rightfully my own. Yet upon each returning Saturday night, I was compelled to deliver every cent of the money to Master Hughes. And why? Not because he earned it, not because he had any hand in earning it, not because I owed it to him, not because he possessed the slightest shadow of a right to it, but solely because he had the power to compel me to give it up. That right of grim-visaged pirate upon the high seas is exactly the same. Hey guys, so that was a pretty hard read, and it was a very long chapter. So I'm just going to briefly go through the questions that we had. So the questions for this are, there's a couple of them. So question 1, why does Mr. Covey whip Frederic? So he actually whips him a couple times, and the main reasons he does is because he doesn't, because he got sick. That seemed to be the big one that kind of solidified things for him. So he was sick and he couldn't get up and he couldn't work, and so Mr. Covey would whip him. But he would whip him for just about anything that he said in the chapter. Um, for not wanting to do something, he would whip slaves for that. And Frederic had this, at this time when he was living with Mr. Covey, um, the first couple of whippings, the first time, it kind of beat a lot of his willpower and his humanity and how he felt as a person out of it. And that said that later on in the chapter, he didn't have that restored for the next 6 months. So, yeah. So why were the slaves so fearful of Mr. Covey? Why did their work go on in his absence? Well, Mr. Covey was a guy who would deceive, and he would lie and say he was going to do something, and then be hiding in the fields, like to watch them work, waiting for them to mess up, so that way he could whip them. And that's terrible. I mean, the whole thing is really terrible. But just the idea that you're just waiting around, waiting for somebody to mess up, like it's hard to wrap your head around. So that's why the work goes on in his absence, because no one knew when he was really around or when he was hiding. So it was never safe to stop for a single minute because, yeah, he was always hiding and waiting for them to mess up. So why did Mr. Covey buy a slave to use as a breeder? Well, because he didn't have a lot of money and he couldn't afford to get all the slaves he wanted for his plantation. So he bought a woman slave to produce more slaves for him. So he basically could like spend the money on one and get as many as that women had children. And that's crazy. So the next question is, why does he hire Mr. Samuel Harrison, a married man? And what irony does Frederic find in this? Well, Mr. Covey pretended that he was like some religious Christian person, and a big thing they say in Christianity is stay true to your wife, stay faithful. And Mr. Covey hired Mr. Samuel Harrison to impregnate his female slave so they could produce more slave children. So, first of all, that idea, so he was making Mr. Harrison cheat on his wife with this woman. And that goes everything against Christianity. And that's what Frederic found funny about it was Mr. Covey pretended to be this huge, high and mighty Christian person, yet he was totally okay with going about and making his slaves do that, which is mind-boggling. So how does Mr. Covey succeed in breaking Frederic, and how does Frederic succeed in again becoming a man? Well, Mr. Covey broke him down over the last couple of over the 6 months that he was there. Well, he was there for a year, but in the first 6 months, he broke him down just with the terrible conditions, how hard he was worked, and the deception, and just always having to stay on your toes like that. Frederic lost himself for a little bit because he was so exhausted. He couldn't think of anything. And Frederic succeeds in again becoming a man after his major whipping, where he ran away to get protection from Mr. Covey. He ran to his old master and said, "Please protect me because this guy's going to kill me," because he was sick and he had his head injured by Mr. Covey. Well, his slave master didn't want to do anything. So when he came back, he eventually faced Mr. Covey and he fought back. And it was him fighting back. It scared Covey because he was like, oh my gosh, this guy could actually hurt me and I don't have all the power over him. And that was enough for Frederic to start to dream and feel like a man again. So why does Frederic go to Master Auld? Oh, hey, I already answered that question. Never mind. Um, so what does Sandy Jenkins suggest for Frederick to do before the fight when he was all concerned about going back because he thought Colby was going to kill him? Do you remember what the slave Sandy Jenkins suggested? Well, he suggested that he go to a certain route and pick it, and as long as he had it in his right pocket, he would never get whipped. So, yeah, that's who that was. So, why was that fight with Mr. Colby, according to Frederick, the turning point in his career as a slave? Well, he decided right then that he was never going to be whipped again or hurt by a white man without him fighting back. This next question is interesting. So, how are the holidays used to discuss the slave with freedom? Well, that time in between Christmas and New Year's, the masters would pretty much try to get their slaves to drink and act like and party and be crazy and have a good time. Um, with the idea that they would do it so much that the idea of returning back to normalcy would be enticing to them. So they would want to go back to being slaves because they couldn't handle the amount of freedom that was given to them. And Frederick, incredibly smart, and he's like pointing this out like, no, this is like what they want for us, so that way we want to be slaves. Um, and that impacted me a lot. I don't know about you guys when you were reading that, but um, yeah. So after he leaves Mr. Covey, um, who was Frederick's new master, and how did he feel about him? So after he left Mr. Covey, he went to live with Mr. Freeland. And Mr. Freeland, Frederick liked a lot. He said that, they worked him hard, but he was very upfront and very honest. You always knew where to find him and what he expected. And he didn't pretend to be religious, which I guess was a big deal to Frederick because a lot of people who were really cruel were very religious and pretended to justify their slavery and everything through the guise of religion. And Mr. Freeland didn't do that. He was just very much like, I am me, perfect, not perfect, and this is what I expect of you. He was still a hard slave master. He was a very hard slave master, but at least in comparison to Mr. Covey, he was better. Um, oh, I already answered the next question. So yeah, Frederick made this point, the contrast between him and then some of the other religious slaveholders around. Um, because his point was that slavery is never okay. And there is no God, no Christian God does not condone slavery. And so the fact that these people who were so high and mighty and religious could also condone slavery, it was hypocritical and it didn't make sense. So, why and where does Frederick begin a Sabbath school? And why is it essential that the slaves tell no one about it? Well, they mentioned it briefly. So he starts a Sabbath school, Frederick does, for the slaves around his plantation and some of the others in the area. And the idea is they went to a free black men's business, and that was where they had their Sabbath school. And it was important that nobody knew what they were doing on the Sabbath because each person, when they walked into the door, if someone found out where they were, they would have to have each of them 39 lashes each. Because the slave owners didn't want them to be learning. They did not want them to have school. Saturday or Sundays were for, church or time with family, catching up on work like your own personal chores, and they wanted you to drink and not do anything important or brain stimulating. Which goes back to other things we talked about in the book about how the slave owners did not want the slaves to think or feel like people. So the next question is, why does Frederick decide to include the slaves in his Sabbath school in his plans to obtain freedom? And why is this dangerous? So they became so close, they moved as one unit, Frederick said. He said the love they had for each other was unparalleled. And because they did everything together and he was teaching them how to read, he was expanding their minds and he was trying to convince them of the plight of slavery and how they were meant for more than that and that they could be more than that. And so as they were learning, he was planning the ideas of freedom and what it means to be an actual, like a human being that could think and make decisions for themselves, which was something they couldn't do. But he was trying to open their eyes because he loved them and he wanted them to come with him because he didn't want them to be separated. And this was dangerous because more people, higher risk of being discovered. And if any of them are discovered, they would either be brought back and their life would be 10 times worse than it was before, or they would just be killed instantly. That's taking a lot of risk. So, Frederick makes the point that many slaves would rather bear the ills we had than fly to others that we knew not of. And how does this help explain why so few slaves escaped? So do you guys get what that means? Basically, it's um, you'd rather keep with what you know than everything that could happen that could be 10 times worse. And and so when they ran away, they knew what to expect when they were slaves. They wouldn't know what life would be like, all the dangers they would face while they were trying to escape, and if they didn't make it. So that's why so few slaves escaped. How did the slaves plan to run away? It was actually a pretty ingenious plan. The idea was Frederick, because his writing was very good, he wrote notes pretending they were all from the slave owner. So they would have, slaves couldn't travel without a pass from their owner. So the idea was he wrote them all passes saying that they were allowed to go to Baltimore on a holiday because they had a break around Easter time. And so then they were going to canoe up because they were less likely to be stopped if they were canoeing because people would think they were fishermen. So, and then from there they would turn around and head north. And it was a pretty good idea actually. And so that was the purpose of the protections. I guess the protections are the name of that note that Frederick wrote for everybody. And yeah, the basic purpose was if they got stopped, they could say that they were going by their master's instructions and they were allowed to go. And because a lot of slave owners and white people, they didn't think that slaves knew how to read and write. And so there's no way that the slave could have written this note and it would have been good enough. So what happens to their plan and how do the protections nearly cause their death? So I guess one of the slaves turned them in the day of their plan. And at first when I was reading it, when Frederick said, like, we've been discovered or we've been found out, I thought maybe he was just so anxious and so nervous he was a little paranoid. But no, like one of the slaves turned him in. It was not one in the group who was running away, but one of the slaves who must have heard about it from word of mouth somewhere turned them in. And so the protections nearly caused their death because if they were found on them, it would have been considered evidence, and then they would have like surely been killed or sold instantly. So what happens to each of the slaves who attempted to run away? Well, they all got marched to jail. And there they sat, and then the slave owners came and took everybody back except Frederick, because they decided that since Frederick was the ringleader of it all, he was the one who had to pay, and so he would be sold. So the next question is, when Frederick returns to Baltimore, what does he do? So yeah, his old slave master, Master Hughes, who was the nice one that had the wife that used to be a really kind lady, they came and picked him up, and they had him come back to Baltimore so he could learn how to caulk ships, which was a good trade. Um, so Frederick, the next question. Frederick decides to fight when he is attacked. What happens to him? What does Mr. Hugh attempt to do for Frederick? Okay, so he goes up there to caulk ships, but because they have such a deadline, they have to get like 2 major ships done by the end of the year. He runs around and he has to go to all the different carpenters, and basically they're all his slave master. And I guess right before he got there was discrepancy because there used to be some black carpenters and stuff there. And the white carpenter said, we're not going to work alongside them. And so he made the owner of the shipyard fire them all. And so things were already contentious, and they wanted to act like they were better than Frederick. And so they ganged up on him and they started beating him up. And he defended himself. He tried to fight back. And it was not fair. It was an unfair assault. He was just defending himself. He didn't start the fight. And all the other people in the shipyard were nearby, and some were like cheering it on and jeering, saying they should kill him. And they didn't do anything. They just allowed it to happen. And so when he got home and told his master what happened, they were enraged, and they were taking care of him. And his master tried to go to the police and get protection and charge the people who did that to Frederick for what they did wrong. And nobody would stand up. And it didn't matter. His word wasn't good enough. And so there was nothing that could be done because no white person had the courage to stand up and say something. And I think it's sad because in some ways it's still the case today. What must Frederick do with the wages he earned in each week as a caulker? So last question. He had to give it to his master every week. So Frederick got really good. He became like the one of the best caulkers at the shipyard. And every week he would have to give all his money to the master. Not because he did anything to deserve it, not because, he owed him for whatever, but just because he was white and he was the master and he was entitled to all the money that Frederick earned. So I know this was a hard chapter to read, but I'm glad we did it. If you have any questions, please get a hold of me. I know it's a hard read, guys, but it's really important with everything that's going on right now, and also just it's important to know the history, so that hopefully to prevent it from happening again. So I miss you guys. I hope you're doing well. Stay safe, and yeah, I'll talk to you soon. Bye.